and David can take it from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Savannah. So I'm a fellow board member of the Baltimore City Historical Society. Really excited to welcome our speaker here this evening in our History Evening lecture series, which you can see prominently displayed behind me. Professor Jean Lee Cole is a professor of English at Loyola University, Maryland, where she teaches courses in American literature, American studies, and gender studies. She's the author of the recently published How the Other Half Laughs, The Comic Sensibility in American Culture, 1895 to 1920, which traces the emergence of the newspaper comic strip and its influence on American culture, and numerous articles on multi-ethnic American literature and periodical studies. She is also the editor or co-editor of several books, including Zora Neale Hurston Collected Plays and Freedom's Witness, the Civil War Correspondence of Henry McNeill Turner. She's a former editor of the scholarly journal American Periodicals and a former president of the Research Society for American Periodicals. And she's also very serious about needlecrafts, gardening, and urban greening, and her tennis game. And Jean lives in a 1860s era row home in Bolton Hill, right here in Baltimore. But this evening, she'll be talking with us about the Women's Literary Club. So some fascinating insight to the individuals in this organization and the organization at large. So with all that said, welcome, Jean, and thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and I should just say that I've worked with David for several years on this project, and so it's really great to be able to bring it to this group. And thank you all for coming today. So the title of my talk is Words and Lives of the Women's Literary Club of Baltimore, 1890 to 1941. And so those dates I hope will kind of place you historically. And I'm going to share my screen and I'll have slides. But as Savannah said, if you have any questions as we go along, please put them in the chat or jot them down and save them for Q&A. I'll be speaking for about 35 minutes and then we should have time for Q&A. So yeah, so anyway, I'm really looking forward to actually getting information from you all because I think you all know a lot about Baltimore history and this is kind of a new subject area for me. All right. In 1891, 5 years after the death of Emily Dickinson, this now familiar poem appeared in print. It begins, "I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They'd banish us, you know." At exactly the same time, a couple dozen fellow nobodies, like Dickinson, all women, were making a mark for themselves in Baltimore society by audaciously forming a club, a women's club, and not only that, a women's literary club. And this was not simply a club for women to learn about literature, to become more cultured and thus more suitable interlocutors for well-educated male companions. It was a club whose primary intention was to produce and publish writing of their own. The Women's Literary Club of Baltimore was the brainchild of two women, both unmarried and both on the downward side of their 20s. Hester Crawford Dorsey had made a splash in the Baltimore American newspaper the year before, writing pert commentaries on gender roles and expectations under the name Celine. Louisa Courtauld Osborne Houghton, a teacher and neighbor of Dorsey, also had literary aspirations. Both were educated and came from respectable families, and given the gender ideology of the time, they presumably sought to establish themselves as society wives. Yet in the winter of 1889 and 1890, they wrote to friends and acquaintances, all women, enlisting their support for their idea. Nearly 40 women attended the club's first meeting, held on March 19th, 1890 at the recently established Goucher College for Women. All of those who attended that first meeting were already published authors. Mary Spear Tiernan had published her novel Homocell with the venerable Boston firm Ticknor and Company in 1881. Her works had also appeared in highly respected monthly magazines, including Harper's, Scribner's, and The Century. Louise Clarkson had published nearly a dozen books of illustrated poetry. A number of the women, including Marguerite Easter, Alice Sourwine Lord, and Lydia Crane, had published fugitive verse in local and regional publications, including The Sun and The American. Other early members included Lizette Woodworth Reese, who became Maryland's Poet Laureate in 1931, Christine Ladd Franklin, the first woman to complete the requirements for a PhD in mathematics at Johns Hopkins, Mae Garretson Evans, the first woman reporter at the Baltimore Sun, and Henrietta Zold, a Jewish American teacher and translator who would eventually establish the Zionist women's organization, Hadassah. They decided at the outset that, quote, those only should belong who had sufficient interest in literature to have devoted some time and thought to original work for either newspapers and magazines, unquote. Then they decided on a name. They debated several possibilities, including the Writers' Club, the Literary League, Contemporary Women, the 19th Century, and my favorite, the Sphinx with a Y. Eventually, they settled upon the Women's Literary Club of Baltimore, Woman's with an A, meaning that it was for woman as a category rather than for individual women. This is something they debated at some length. They chose their club color, which was violet, and they adopted a motto, Parole Femine, the second half of the Maryland state motto, Fati Masciai Parole Femine, probably murdering that pronunciation, translated as manly deeds, womanly words. In all this, they declared their identities as women, as writers, and as proud Marylanders. Here's the logo that they used in all their publications thereafter. The WLCB met almost without interruption for the next 5 decades. The motto of longtime president Letitia Renshaw was, quote, consistency, thou art a jewel, unquote. And they lived that motto. They always met on Tuesday afternoons and met every Tuesday between October and May, with a brief hiatus for the Christmas and New Year's holidays. This left the summer months free for members to escape the city heat in travel or stays at summer homes. They capped their membership at 100, and between 30 and 50 members attended most meetings. They met at the same place. Between 1891 and 1921, the assembly room of the Maryland Academy of Sciences, which was then located across Franklin Street from the Enoch Pratt Library. And after 1921, at the Arundel Club at 1000 North Charles Street. Most meetings also followed the same format. At the beginning of each program, they always spelled it with 2 M's and an E. The club president would call the meeting to order, and the secretary would read the minutes of the previous meeting. And I think this could take some time because the minutes were quite long. The remainder of the program would consist of papers or literary works, the majority written by club members and organized around a topic by one of about a dozen committee chairmen. Yes, chairmen. Each committee focused on a different topic, including fiction, poetry, and drama, but also essays, translation, as in this slide, travel, art, history, especially Maryland and colonial history, and even architecture and archaeology. Some women read their own work. Some chose to have another member read it for them. Presentations also took other forms. They could consist of the sharing of a photograph or a piece of art, a letter from an important figure, or a musical performance. The committee setting was where the members presented their work and received, as one member put it, quote, a baptism of friendly criticism, unquote. In addition to these weekly meetings, the club also hosted monthly salons, social gatherings with musical programs and refreshments to which club members were allowed to bring guests. The most lavish of these public programs were the 12th night celebrations held by the club for many years, which commemorated the Epiphany holiday in music, literary recitations, and refreshments. One year, the Sun described the appearance of a huge cake reminiscent of the king cake we see today during Mardi Gras. Into it were baked 12th night symbols, quote, eagerly looked for by the younger guests to indicate their fortunes, the ring, the piece of money, the bean, thimble, and pen, unquote. Another notable feature of several of the 12th night celebrations was a, quote, stuffed peacock in a nest of Christmas greens, unquote, that was arranged on a silver platter and paraded aloft to the oohs and ahs of the collected guests. On All Souls Day, November 2nd, club members also decorated the graves of authors and artists buried in Maryland. Among those honored were Edgar Allan Poe, Junius Brutus Booth, John Pendleton Kennedy, Sidney Lanier, Colonel Richard Malcolm Johnston, William H. Reinhardt, and founding club member Mary Spear Tiernan. In 1907, members of the WLCB organized the Edgar Allan Poe Memorial Association in advance of the centennial of his birth in 1909. Members of the association were responsible for raising the funds to create the statue of Poe that now graces the courtyard of the Student Center at the University of Baltimore, which is visible from Mount Royal Avenue. To provide inspiration for members, the club maintained a library of books written by themselves as well as their fellow Maryland authors. The library was established sometime before 1892 and quickly became a valued extension of the club. It functioned in many ways as a repository of female intellect and a symbol of female creativity and imagination, what Virginia Woolf would characterize nearly 4 decades later as a room of one's own. The club library demonstrated a sense of pride and ownership in an age where even wealthy women did not have much they could really truly call their own. While the club library has not survived, my students and I recreated a virtual version of the library. And Savannah, oh, I should have, whoops. Okay.
Yeah.
I guess you can't copy and paste the link. That's okay. I'll just show you a little bit of it. Okay. So this is the library. We actually built an online archive, which you can see here, hosted by the Loyola Notre Dame Library, and part of the website is the virtual library, and it contains, as you can see here, it contains links. Pages for each author and links to many digital reproductions of hundreds of published works. I'll just quickly show you an example of one page. This is a member named Lucy Meacham Thruston, who wrote several novels as well as several books of poetry. And some of these works are only available at archives. This is one actually that we got from, we were given permission to reproduce by the University of Maryland. And it's really quite lovely. It's illustrated poetry. So I'll just show you, I'll just scroll through a few pages. Yeah, okay. So I will switch back to the slides now. The Women's Literary Club of Baltimore completed its final season in May 1941. Louisa Houghton, who was one of the originators of the club and a member during its entire existence, served as president during the club's final 2 seasons. Consistency, thou art a jewel. The WLCB's final meeting celebrated National Poetry Week with a contest for the best poem written by a club member. But I've so far have not been able to figure out who won that contest. And that's one of the things I'd love to find out. As you can see in the virtual library we've compiled, the club was indeed successful in producing published authors. Of the 300 or so active members that we've documented, we've discovered over 50 who were published with over 500 publications to their names. And this is not counting the regularly assigned news and columns produced by journalists in the group, which would certainly produce the total number of publications into the thousands. Their meeting programs showcased members' original literature and essays side by side with the poetry of Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning, William Shakespeare, and their favorite Southern poet, Sidney Lanier, next to whom one club president, Frances Litchfield Turnbull, is buried. They wrote novels and short stories across a range of genres, including not just what literary historian Nina Baim described as women's fiction, but also historical fiction set in the US and around the world, female Bildungsromans, social reform novels, mysteries, and memoir, formal and free verse in lyric, dramatic, narrative, and comic modes, translations of works written by French, Italian, German, Russian, and Jewish authors, and dramatic works ranging from topical one-acts to dramatic monologues to full-length musical comedies. Following the conventions of the time, they also published works that we might not consider literary today, things like philosophical treatises, history, literary, musical, and dramatic criticism, and biography, among others. In 2020, my students and I published a large anthology of works by 40 club members dating from 1890 to 1920, titled Parole Femine, Words and Lives of the Women's Literary Club of Baltimore. And this is something that's available on Amazon and also maybe available at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. But yeah, you can look it up on Amazon and buy it if this presentation makes you curious. The funding goes back to Loyola's Apprentice House press. So that's one aspect of the project. But the WLCB also, I think it's important to note, was part of a larger zeitgeist. The women's club movement flourished in the late 19th century and involved an estimated 2 million women across the United States from a wide range of religious, social, and ethnic racial groups. Women's clubs were a fundamental part of the burgeoning women's rights movement that culminated in the suffrage campaigns of the early 20th century and the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. The vast majority of these clubs engaged primarily in philanthropic endeavors and service work. The WLCB was one of a few to focus on literary pursuits. You'd think that the unusual focus of the club would have been remembered. Yet the WLCB has been buried under decades of forgetting, aided and abetted by both the continuing dominance of male-centered historiography and the female club members' internalization of patriarchy. Aside from a few profiles published in the Baltimore Sun by club member and Sun reporter Emily Emerson Lance, the WLCB's activities and accomplishments have only been documented in brief notes appearing on the Sun's social pages. No mention of the club exists in histories of Maryland or Baltimore as far as I've found. Even literary histories such as Frank Shiver's Maryland Wits and Baltimore Bards fail to mention the club or its authors, excepting Lizette Woodworth Reese. And she was not named Maryland Poet Laureate until 1931, just a few years before her death in 1935, even though she reached the height of her popularity decades before. Speaking in general terms, women's accomplishments have not been recognized as a through line for human history. The dominant narratives, by and large, and to the present day, have told the story of nation states and focused on the actions of political and religious leaders and the conflicts between them. The figures involved in these narratives, queens excluded perhaps, have been men. Yet the history of women is crucial to understanding human history. Women, after all, have always made up at least half of the human population. The notion that women's history has been lost, that it went unrecorded, that women left no traces of their activities, their art, their thought, has been painstakingly dismantled by feminist historians who have gleaned historical information from clothing and home furnishings, located diaries, journals, artworks, and unpublished manuscripts in archives and attics, and read between the lines of historical accounts passed down by male historians to trace the women moving the levers of state behind the scenes, or sometimes in plain sight. We see some of these histories being recovered and making it to Netflix and HBO, which is great, but so much work still needs to be done. The WLCB documents, for example, reside here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, and I and my students have just begun the process of mining their depths. The club carefully and copiously took down its history in the form of detailed meeting minutes, membership lists and dues records, and privately published club documents. The WLCB collection at the Maryland Center for History and Culture comprises some 3,000 pages of minutes stretching from the club's foundation in 1890 through 1920, programs from each of the over 1,000 meetings held between 1890 and 1914, copies of the club's constitution, member logbooks, and 2 large scrapbooks containing newspaper clippings about the club and other news relating to women. Historian Anne Ruggles-Geer has written that the women's club's meticulous efforts at documentation were efforts at self-definition and self-determination. So it shouldn't be surprising that clubs are highly protective of their documents and their meetings, carefully controlling who has access and how documents can be used. The WLCB explicitly prohibited men from attending their regular meetings, and they included a clause in their constitution stating that, quote, no report of the meetings be given to the press without the approval of an officer of the club, unquote. It may be that the club's protectiveness of their documents is one reason why they have remained hidden for so long. I stumbled upon this collection of documents at MHCH, then known as the Maryland Historical Society, while looking for local literary societies that my students could study. And I'm really happy to say that one of those students is here tonight, which is awesome for me. It's like closing the loop. But since then, I've worked with individual students and several classes. Another student is also here, and I'll be asking her to talk here briefly. And these classes have actually transcribed lots and lots of these materials and also helped to establish kind of baseline research on the WLCB. And I think we've seen it, we've come to see it as a kind of example, typical example, I think, of turn of the century female intellectual activity and literary production. In the process, we've created an online archive, which I mentioned before, and we've also written biographies of individual club members, which are on the website and also in the anthologies. We've also located hundreds of publications and transcribed thousands of pages of documents. So I actually want to ask Marina Fazio, who worked on the project 3 years ago, just to talk a little bit about what she took away from it, especially looking back on this now. Marina has long graduated, is now a teacher in Baltimore City Public Schools, and I haven't actually asked her this question, so I'm as curious as you to hear her answer. So Marina, could you unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Cole, for letting me know this event was happening. She said I've long graduated. I graduated in 2019, so not that long graduated. But what I took away from this, first of all, I didn't know what I was signing up for when I signed up for Dr. Cole's class. I had no idea what kind of work would be going into it. But I was very interested in being able to go into the Maryland Historical Society. Being able to look at the documents was really neat for me, and to know that kind of resource is in Baltimore because I am a teacher. And knowing that sort of thing exists is a good thing because I do teach in Baltimore City. But even more than that, it was really interesting to be able to connect with the history of Baltimore City, the history of women writers in Baltimore City, because I'm not originally from here, but I do live here now. And it's been really good to be able to connect with a part of the history of the city that isn't necessarily talked about a lot. And also to kind of grapple with the complexities of learning about this history of the city, because these women writers were complex people. That's something we had to address in the class, and that was definitely an interesting thing to be able to discuss and reflect on our own current experiences. How do we celebrate their history while also acknowledging they were human beings who very much adopted views of the time. And yeah, it was just very interesting being able to engage in history at this level, feeling more connected to the Baltimore community, and I really enjoyed it.
Well, that's awesome. And I feel like I planted you because I'm actually going to be touching on some of those issues in the next few minutes. So I think, so you've heard from Marina, and I think that this idea that this gives a different picture of Baltimore than what often comes across in kind of the popular media and so on, I think is really important. But I think for me, speaking for myself, not being a trained historian, for me, the most palpable discovery, and I think this was true for a lot of students too, was just realizing how difficult it was to figure out who these women were. I mean, we kind of went around and around, like, who are these people? We couldn't find their names. And we couldn't find anything out about them because we didn't know what their real names were. And so, you know, and even though all these records were here, it was really difficult to kind of find out, like, where, like, you know, these search terms that you need in order to actually find information about people. And I think it was really surprising to me that even though this group was pretty intimate, you know, I mean, the membership was pretty stable. It was a private group. They met each other every week. They knew each other really well. But in the club documents, nearly all the club members referred to one another by their husbands' names, Mrs., John, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And the unmarried members were simply referred to by Miss and their last name, omitting their first names and making them virtually impossible to locate in historical records, especially when they had names like Smith, for example. So we had a really hard time looking in the census and contemporary newspapers, you know, the kinds of sources that we tend to turn to find out information about people. And so this really underscored for us that if women's history and women's stories had been effaced from the historical record, you know, we felt this viscerally on an almost daily basis. So I just want to tell you about one of the most tantalizingly obscure figures we encountered, who was Lydia Crane. And she served as the recording secretary of the club from 1892 until 1913. So she, the recording secretary, was responsible for taking minutes of each meeting. And so even though the club members approved the minutes, she obviously wielded a lot of power in representing the club because she was the person who described what they did. She was the person who decided how much detail to include and what to omit. Through the minutes, everyone who worked on this project has become intimately familiar with Lydia. We started to call her Lydia, with Lydia's unique voice. Articulate, detailed, opinionated, always very proper, while also conveying a warm affection for her fellow club members. Lydia's minutes lent color and character to the highly organized and rigidly procedural club meetings. Lydia's minutes take up more than half of the 3,000 pages of extant minutes. And these minutes also document the decades of her life during which she devoted herself to recording the proceedings of the club. Ironically, she never published much of her own. There were just a few poems that she published in local publications, and we have not been able to locate any of them. And one of the most kind of poignant things about her was we actually took a trip to Greenmount Cemetery to look for the gravestones of some of the members. And this is the best we could find for Lydia Crane. And you can see that we're almost positive it's her tombstone, but as you can see, the carving on the stone has been erased through the ravages of time. But even as her personhood has been erased from the pages and even the stone memorials of history, her voice dominates our understanding of the club. And for that reason, we see her as a kind of co-author for this project. At the same time, Lydia Crane was a very frustrating person to work with. She actually, I think, as a person, prevents us from understanding the club history as well as we could. Miss Crane, as she referred to herself, was no feminist, and she totally embraced the club's mission, which I've put in this slide. This is from the Constitution. That the club was formed to encourage exact and noble thinking among our women, hoping to prove that added strength will cultivate larger grace of speech and manner, keener instincts of pure womanhood, a deeper appreciation of the precious opportunities of the home life, with a truer comprehension of its responsibilities, a broader and not less loving and believing heart. And this adherence to the instincts of pure womanhood was perhaps most marked and most frustrating to us as researchers in her refusal to use first names. Without them, it was very difficult to find out anything about them. It was only after months of research that we stumbled upon a number of members' first names on a signed pledge that happened to be included in the middle of an otherwise blank membership roll book. Here, it's one of the only instances that we have ever located the full name of Letitia Humphreys Renshaw. That's the first name listed here. And she served as club president for 16 years. Okay, so we, when we found her name, we were ecstatic. Armed with this list, we were both shocked and elated when we discovered that Mrs. Fabian Franklin, a founding member who was a vocal and regular contributor to meetings during the club's first decade, went about in real life as Christine Ladd Franklin, who I mentioned before was the first woman to complete PhD requirements in mathematics at Johns Hopkins. We also discovered that she was a respected scholar in the disciplines of mathematics and psychology. Mrs. Charles M. Lord was Alice Sauerwein Lord, a poet whose work appeared in a variety of Southern publications. Mrs. Albert L. Richardson was, in fact, club founder Hester Crawford Dorsey. And then one of the most surprising discoveries was Mrs. Sidney Turner, who was, in fact, born Clara Newman and was raised alongside her cousin, Emily Dickinson. Lydia Crane also sought to smooth over differences and minimize conflict, and frequently omitted points of view or perspectives with which she disagreed. For example, while we now know that a number of the club's members, including Christine Ladd Franklin, for example, supported suffrage, the very idea of the women's vote was almost never mentioned. This was true even in the winter months of 1906, when the National American Women's Suffrage Association, headlined by Susan B. Anthony, held its national convention just blocks away from the club's meeting rooms here in Baltimore. The convention was almost certainly attended by club members, but it is not even mentioned in the minutes. It actually took reading the club members' publications to understand that they actually held a much wider worldview than what we saw reflected in the notes of Miss Crane. Some indeed defended the values of what historian Barbara Welter has described as the cult of true womanhood: purity, piety, domesticity, and submissiveness. Here, for example, is a poem by Clara Newman Turner, the aforementioned cousin of Emily Dickinson, in a poem that Dickinson herself would never have written. Motherhood. It had a gift to give, nor could it live to give again. The gift of love in setting sore of pain, a child to earth. The boundless mother love of heaven returned, the price to pay of such a gift, the sacrifice again of love to birth. Others espoused the social, economic, and intellectual freedom represented by the figure of the new woman, sought an education and career, lived alone or with other women, and asserted an independent identity as a voting citizen. One of the most colorful of these was Louise Malloy, who had a play produced on Broadway, wrote jokes and comic verse for the Baltimore American for over 20 years, and was a supportive and active member of the WLCB for much of that time. Here's a poem that Louise Malloy wrote for the Baltimore American humor column in 1911, and this is under the pseudonym Josh Wink, was the pseudonym that she used. Girl, sweet, nice, neat, bright eye, cute, shy. Man, brave, tall, grave, looks seem, girl's dream. Nuff said, they're wed. With ties, love flies. L'envoy, life's gall, that's all. Ooh, what happened to my slides? Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that little bit of doggerel. Several members also appeared to have lived lives primarily within self-defined communities of women. One of these was Lizette Woodworth Reese, who never married but maintained strong relationships with women and wrote passionate poems to and about women and never to men. I will admit, however, that many of my students were disappointed that so many of the club women were so, well, traditional. But as archivist, historian, and project volunteer Cynthia Requart has noted, To fully understand women's history, it is not enough to concentrate solely on feminists who rebelled. It is equally necessary to understand how, quote, the majority of women accepted and coped with the restrictions placed on their lives, unquote. Such understanding may help us better to understand the challenges facing those who seek societal change today as well as in the past. In similar fashion, we've also struggled to understand why WLCB members so frequently express nostalgia for the Confederacy and have been dismayed and sometimes horrified by their racism. The club did not admit Black members, and more than a few women who belonged to the WLCB also belonged to the Daughters of the Confederacy. Club programs included stories and poems full of Black dialect, and at least one of these may have been performed at a club meeting in blackface. They discussed articles celebrating the Aryan race, quote, a race of people destined to spread and conquer, as Mrs. Walter R. Bullock, AKA Carolyn Canfield Bullock, declared in 1900. A noticeable portion of their published works fell neatly in line with lost cause ideology, depicting grateful former slaves and refined Southern families whose lives were destroyed at the hands of rapacious, crass Northerners. It was difficult for many of my students to reconcile these beliefs with the women they had come to know and to whom they had dedicated so much time and energy. At the same time, goodness knows, practically every Southern family had an enslaved person in their family tree, and to paraphrase literary historian Tony Horwitz, at least one Confederate in every attic. This is not to dismiss or minimize the racist attitudes espoused by the club, but rather to acknowledge that one cannot depict Southern culture of the time without encountering the anxious hegemony of white supremacy. One student wrote, quote, the project's goal at its beginning was to recover the lost literary lives of Baltimore women, to recover their stories and voices from the dustbin of history. And we have done that. We do not shy away from including those works that made the women's racism apparent. To ignore those works would have been irresponsible. It is important not to sanitize these women's legacy because for so many of them, it is a legacy of Confederate sympathy, of romanticization of the Old South, and of racism, unquote. Including and discussing these works lets us give an accurate picture of what the social views of educated middle and upper middle class white Baltimore women were really like at this time. And they can even give us some historical context for our present day discussions about Confederate monuments, Black Lives Matter, and other lingering wounds from a national cataclysm that still has not been completely resolved. In short, we have tried to bring these women's voices into the light, even if what they were saying, even if they weren't saying what we had hoped or expected. And it is our hope that the online archive we've created, as well as the Parole Femine anthology, will provide starting points for future research. Most importantly, this project has revealed the existence of several writers whose work calls for closer scrutiny and deeper exploration. And I'm actually going to be starting to do this this year while I'm on sabbatical. In addition to the aforementioned Louise Malloy, we discovered Baltimore Sun reporter Emily Emerson Lance, who wrote dozens of profiles of Baltimore streets and neighborhoods that provide an alternative perspective on a conception of early 20th century Baltimore that is currently dominated by the legacy of H.L. Mencken. We might also make note of Grace Danielle Litchfield, a prolific and widely read poet favorably compared to Sarah Teasdale and Edna St. Vincent Millay. These poets, incidentally, were dismissed as hopelessly middlebrow by the academic establishment of the mid-20th century, but are now receiving renewed attention from feminist literary scholars. And these are just a few of the people that I think are worth further study. We hope that our research helps to reintroduce these writers to a new generation. If you're interested in finding out more about these women, you can read our anthology, or you can check out our website and Facebook page. We are still just beginning to learn about these women. So I also, if you recognize any of their names or know anything about them, please include that in the chat. or reach out to me by email. You can just look on the Loyola website, English department. I'm easy to find there. And yeah, so that's what I have today. I really thank you for inviting me and to come speak with you tonight. And now I'd love to hear questions and comments.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Cole. And I know we did have a few questions that or comments that popped up through the course of the talk. So if those folks want to unmute themselves and expand on their questions, we welcome that, or I can just read them. So Janet Felston, did you want to expand on your question? Why did it end? I believe that's referring to the end of the club in 1941, correct?
Sure, yeah, and I'm thinking the minutes must have been really interesting at that point where they decided to close down. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, the minutes at Maryland Historical, well, sorry, I keep messing up, MHCH, they actually end in 1920. So this is actually one of the aspects of the history that I'm also at some point going to try to piece back together, because I think there might be some, I don't know, maybe the minutes are somewhere else, but I haven't found them. But you know, this is when you start getting into like trying to reassemble what they did based on these short newspaper accounts on the social pages, or seeing if there's correspondence from individual women in their papers or their collections. Things like that. So I don't know what they said about why it ended, but I would speculate that they had trouble with attendance even going into the late teens. And I think between the passage of female suffrage and then also the kind of reinvigoration of women's rights movements as a result of leading into World War II, that it just became kind of unfashionable to belong to a club like this. And there were other clubs too that I think kind of took their place. Oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the poet. There was a group of there was a poetry group that formed in the 1920s. Maybe someone here can remember the name of the poet. I think she was married to the rector of St. Paul's, Old St. Paul's. They met in the rectory, I think. So I think that kind of like took some of the energy from the literary people who were involved in the club, and it kind of moved into other venues. Yeah, great question.
Sure, Sue, if you want to, Sue Wilson Brooks, if you'd like to unmute yourself, go ahead.
So I will be reaching out to you. I've been looking for some time for connections that Augusta Tucker, author of Miss Susie Schlegel and The Man Miss Susie Loved, who is a book with a great deal about Johns Hopkins, and been trying to figure out who Augusta Tucker knew for research into personalities beyond what she got from archives. And although this group may predate when she came to town, boy, they sound like affiliations of women, partly Confederate women, that she would have known. And I'll be curious to see if you know, Crenshaw is the name of Hopkins, one of his sisters, and there is a Crenshaw who's not her, but I'm curious to see whether you can help me with any associations.
Great. Yeah, there's actually on our website, there's actually a membership list that goes year by year. There's a ton of information on the website, which is a little hard to find because the project kind of exploded beyond what we expected. And so the website is not really organized in a way that makes the really cool information easy to find. That's another task I have for sabbatical, is actually to figure out how to reorganize the website. But you might look there to see if you can find names that you're familiar with.
Yeah. Tucker may not have come by 1920, but I bet she knew some of these women.
Yeah, that's great.
So I had a brief comment and a follow-up question. Probably one of the more nationally and internationally known figures that you mentioned is Henrietta Zold. And one of the significant things about her, and I think makes her stand out here too, is her Jewish background and, you know, the activism that she went on to pursue. So one piece of that, she also was a graduate of Western High School, which many of us local folks will recognize as still an all female public high school in Baltimore, which is pretty incredible, and just had their 175th anniversary. But I was wondering, was she definitely the only Jewish or non-Christian member? And was there any conversation? Was that controversial in any way, or did it just kind of matter-of-factly become part of the club's history?
Yeah, she was, when I first started, I think when Courtney and I first started looking at the stuff in the club, she was the one figure that everybody said, oh, she was part of this club and she was really important. But she actually left the club very early. She was only a member for a couple of years. And as far as I know, I looked through the membership list, and I think she was the only Jewish member. There was some religious diversity, though. There were Catholic and Protestant women in the club, which I don't know if that's interesting or not. Maybe somebody can weigh in on that. But she, it's really interesting when you look at the minutes from the first few years, because she clearly was kind of like leading these, asking the women to really consider like issues that were happening in like Tsarist Russia and all this stuff, and wanting them to actually like think about socialism and stuff like that. And a number of the more politically oriented members also left with Zold right around 1893. I think they just found the literary focus of the club too limiting. And what you see after those women leave is that the club becomes much more genteel, much less kind of politically engaged. Yeah, Courtney, did you want to say anything about that or about anything else?
I'm so glad I came to this, because it's so great to hear all of the things that you guys learned afterwards, because I felt very lost. I think I really dove in deep and had a very little idea of like what was going on.
And at the time I didn't know what was there either, and I was expecting 3 or 4 students to actually sign up for this group, and Courtney was the only one who volunteered and wanted to do archival research. And so poor Courtney was kind of like holed up at the Maryland Historical Society, like freaking out because there was so much stuff there. And and this all kind of was revealed over the course of the semester, and I just felt terrible for, I just threw you into the swimming pool, and but she survived.
It was great. It was such a great experience, and I really enjoyed learning about it. But it's been great to see all of the broader context that you guys have discovered, and that that you were saying there's still so much more work to do. But even just like a lot of the questions I had about their lack of social activism or engagement in like local issues. I remember there being a few things about them being interested in education, but there was very minimal. There was very little talk about anything else going on outside of the club. And so it's very interesting to me to learn about the other perspectives that maybe weren't included in just the like club notes.
Yeah. Mike?
Yeah, that you mentioned here 1893 as a divide, and that's a significant year. And it might, that was a year of a major depression and a lot of social unrest. And, that might be, if I could see why, if some of the more socially concerned members left in that year, there might be a hook to their response to social conditions, while so perhaps the more conservative and more economically secure folks might have had real differences of opinion about a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually, I would love for that to be true. Um, but I suspect it was mostly because Elizabeth Ellicott King was one of the leaders of the charge away from the club. She was actually vice president of the club early on. And I think what they ended up doing was forming their own club, the Arundel Club. They ended up forming the Arundel Club. So yeah, I got a sense that it was more generational than it was political. But sometimes it's hard to see, they kind of align that way too. Yeah. So I guess Chris Potts, you had a question about where club members were from.
Yes.
I
was wondering about that. Were they just from Baltimore City and or county, or did they come in from other surrounding counties as well? I'm thinking in particular Harford County.
I think there were people from Howard County. I'm not sure about Harford. So there were members. A lot of the members lived in Mount Vernon initially, and also in Bolton Hill, and then when when Roland Park became a neighborhood, like a lot of the members actually moved there. There's also a map on the website that actually shows some of the kind of like migration of the members, and they kind of generally moved northwest. There are also a number of members who lived in Mount Washington, because one of the early members, it was like people brought their friends. So you see these kind of like clusters of friend groups from different places. So there were actually a few people from Ellicott City in that area. There was also one member who I think came once a year from West Virginia. And so, and then there were members who then moved away, and then they remained in contact with the club, and they would be honorary members. And so they might correspond with the club, but not actually attend meetings. So.
Hi, Dr. Cole. Lauren Chiswick. Sorry, my video is not working right now. So awesome to hear your talk. This is fantastic. I have a question. I know a little bit about the Turnbulls, and I was curious. I know that I don't know how to pronounce her first name.
Francis.
Is it Francis? Okay. Like I know she was the first president of the club, presumably was a writer, but her husband, Lawrence Turnbull, published Southern literary journals, was a patron, helped support Sidney Lanier. And it's just very curious because I feel like it seemed a little unusual. And it just, did you get a sense of her as her own separate person, separate from sort of her work with her husband?
Yes. It's like she was totally her own person.
Cool.
And one of the things I kind of love about doing the research on the club is they never talk about their husbands. But she actually published, I think, 5 novels. She was actually one of the she wrote historical fiction. And so she actually wrote several that were set in Venice during, I think, the Medici period. And she wrote a novel about a young queen of Cyprus, who I think is a historical figure. So, what she did was kind of write these historical novels that were that had female protagonists. But she was pretty fussy. I will say she was not one of our favorite members of the club. And she was the one who wrote that club, mission statement on that slide. And so she really drove the kind of she led the conservative faction of the club. And so
Confederate sympathizing.
Yeah.
Hardcore.
Yeah. Yep. And she was also a big champion of Sidney Lanier, and obviously the connection between the two Turnbulls and him. You know, we just were freaked out when we found out that they had buried Sidney Lanier next to them in their plot at Green Mountain Cemetery. But a cool thing about the Turnbulls, so Grace Daniel Litchfield, who I mentioned was one of the writers who we really want to, or that I really want to recover, was actually Frances Litchfield Turnbull's sister. And so
I thought so, because their daughter is named Grace Turnbull, so after her aunt.
exactly. Yeah, and I think Grace Turnbull also may have been a member, but she was in that later period where we don't have the records. But I actually was contacted kind of out of the blue by a descendant of the family, and he actually was the keeper of the family papers. And they had this box of stuff that was from mostly Frances and Grace Turnbull. And he just wanted to get it out of his garage. You know, I think he was like, you know, I think these are historically interesting, but I want somebody else to take them. And so he actually he lives in Ohio, and he was visiting family in Maryland and actually drove to my house here in Baltimore and like left them with me. I mean, he was just like, you know, I'm entrusting these papers to you. And so there's actually all kinds of stuff in there that I haven't even had a chance to dig into, but including things like the journals that Frances Litchfield kept when she was a teenager. You know, so there's a lot of really cool stuff there. I just wish I liked her more as a person, you know.
No,
yeah, thanks for that.
I love that insight. That's so interesting. Thank you.
So the citation from all that stuff would be the Jean Lee Cole collection?
Well, I really think that I need to talk to somebody at Hopkins, because they have the Grace Daniel Litchfield papers. They have the Frances Litchfield Turnbull papers. So they really belong there, but I'm not sure if Hopkins wants them. And if they don't, maybe I will keep them, you know, I'll by appointment only, like that. Yeah.
I had another question.
Well, this was wonderful.
Sorry.
One more question.
I was just wondering if, since a lot of the participants were published writers, but in different venues, some of them had connections to publishing. Did you have a sense that part of the literary club's mission was to build connections for people who were interested, or did you sort of already have to be established in order to be accepted into the club?
Yeah, I love that question. So one of the research projects that I have, it's a conference paper that I was supposed to have given last year, but then COVID happened. But if you look, one of the things that's so great about the website that we made is that it actually helps to facilitate all kinds of digitally enhanced research, you know, because we can search for stuff and we can like do all these things with all the data that students like Marina and all these classes like laboriously entered spreadsheet after spreadsheet of stuff. But one of the cool things that you can see is the different connections between the women. And so what I'm doing now is working from the publication side and looking at groups of women who all published in the same magazine. And what you can see is that there's reviewers and poets and short story writers and nonfiction writers who are all publishing in the same magazine. And I'm pretty sure they must have helped each other to get into print. So, and they reviewed each other's books, so it was definitely about kind of creating a network of women who could support each other. So yeah, that's part of the research that I'm going to be continuing to do. So thank you for allowing me to talk about that.
No more questions before I start speaking. Don't want to cut anybody else off. This was wonderful, Professor Cole. I really appreciate you being with us here this evening. And just a selfish plug. We mentioned the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Our library is back open for in-person researchers. So the former Maryland Historical Society, from when you were doing your work, just rebranded last year, but we definitely welcome researchers to come down, obviously by appointment, distanced, all those precautions are in place, but it's an incredible collection to really dig into. And, I applaud everything that you and your students were able to do, but sounds like there's more work and more stories to uncover. So Mike, I'm gonna share real quick. Oh, I'm not gonna share because I was just gonna share our sponsors, do my due diligence there. And then we do have one more talk left in our series. But just a quick shout. Our sponsors, Arcadia Publishing and Trace Architects, allow us to, their support allows us to put on these programs, which are always free, but we certainly welcome folks to check out Baltimore City Historical Society, consider becoming members, and different ways that you can support the organization. But I will let Mike talk about our final talk of the season coming up next month.
Thank you, David. And let me just begin by apologizing. I was briefly unmuted there when I thought I was muted, so excuse me for that. Yes, these Baltimore History Evenings take place on the third Thursday of the month, January through June. So that means we have one more left. So on June 17th at 7 p.m. at the different Zoom address, but it'll be on Zoom. Professor John Tillman, who is Associate Professor of History at Tuskegee University and is the winner of our 2019 Joseph Arnold Prize for Outstanding Writing in Baltimore History. This is in my humble opinion, the premier prize for writing in Baltimore history that the Baltimore City Historical Society awards. He won the prize for his paper, The Show of Strength Such As Seldom Seen, Blackbusting and the Black Electoral Politics in 1950s Baltimore West Side. That's a long title, but it's about a really key period in Baltimore history, when after World War II, blackbusting enabled black homeowners to move into formerly white neighborhoods in Baltimore's Old Fourth District, which enabled independent black politicians to undermine the white political machine's power. So here we have blackbusting and electoral politics as part of Baltimore's civil rights and political empowerment history. A very important new perspective on what is, before the time of many people here who are on this Zoom session, but still part of modern Baltimore history. And you never know, we may have people tuning in who are participants in this important movement in our city's history. So I hope everybody will join us for that. It'll be a fine conclusion to, I think, our very fine season that we've put on for you. So thank you very much, and thank you for being here.
One last word of closing. I just want to let everybody know that we do have a YouTube page that has the past recordings available for watching. So if you saw any names on that list and you're interested to hear more about what they had to say, I think you can just search Baltimore City Historical Society on YouTube. We also have a Facebook page that you can follow, Baltimore City Historical Society, there as well. And we hope to see you at our next event. Thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Cole, for joining us tonight and sharing your great research with us.
Thanks. It was super fun. Thank you all for coming and listening.
Your being here makes it happen, folks.
Take care, everybody.
Right.